The wind blew across the wide desert land, carrying sand, dust, and silence together. The sky glowed red as the sun slowly sank behind the mountains. A cowboy named Luke rode his tired brown horse down a dry trail, his hat pulled low against the light. His life had been lonely for many years. He had fought in the war and lost more than he wanted to remember. After that, he built a small ranch far away from the noise of people and towns. He lived quietly with only his horse and a few cows for company. That evening, he was riding home after fixing a broken fence near the river. The air was getting cold and he wanted to reach his cabin before night fell. But as he crossed a patch of dry grass near the river bend, something caught his eye. It looked like a pile of clothes lying in the dirt. At first, he thought it was just old fabric or trash left by travelers. But then the pile moved. Luke stopped his horse and narrowed his eyes. He climbed down slowly and walked closer. The shape on the ground was a person, a woman. Her skin was dry, her lips cracked, and her dress torn from thorns. She lay half covered in dust, barely breathing. Her face was marked with dirt and pain, but even in that broken state she looked young and strong. Luke knelt beside her, pressing his fingers gently to her neck. Her pulse was weak but still there. She was alive. He quickly took off his canteen and poured a little water into the cap. He lifted her head and tried to give her a few drops. She coughed at first, then swallowed. Her eyes opened for a short second. They were dark brown, full of fear and confusion. She looked at him, not understanding who he was or what was happening. Luke spoke softly. "Easy now, you're safe. Don't try to talk," but she didn't answer. She closed her eyes again, breathing unevenly. Luke looked around. The sand around her showed marks of many horses. There were deep hoof prints leading away, and in the middle of them, small footprints that matched hers. He could tell she had been left there on purpose. He had heard stories before, about tribes punishing their own by sending them away with nothing. Maybe she had broken a law or angered her chief. Whatever it was, she had been left here to die under the burning sun. Luke didn't think for long. He couldn't leave her there. He took off his jacket, wrapped it around her, and lifted her carefully into his saddle. She was light, weak, and barely moving. He climbed up behind her, holding her steady as his horse began the slow ride back to the ranch. The journey took hours. The desert grew darker with every step, the cold wind replacing the heat of the day. The stars came out one by one, bright and endless. Luke rode quietly, listening to the woman's weak breaths against his chest. Sometimes she whispered something in a soft language he couldn't understand, words filled with sadness and fear. He whispered back, "You're gonna make it, just hold on." His voice was calm, almost like he was talking to himself. By the time they reached his cabin, it was past midnight. The moon hung high above, lighting the small wooden house. Luke carried her inside and laid her on his bed. The cabin was small, just one room with a stove, a table, and a bed. He lit a lantern and looked at her closely for the first time. Her arms were covered in bruises, and there were cuts on her feet where she had walked barefoot. Her face was tired, her eyes sunken, but there was something gentle in her features, something that made him feel she didn't belong to a cruel world. He took a clean cloth, soaked it in water, and started washing the dust from her face and hands. She moved slightly, whispering again, but still not waking up. Luke covered her with a warm blanket and sat beside her, feeding the fire in the stove. He hadn't had company in years. The sound of another person breathing inside his cabin felt strange but comforting. As hours passed, she started shivering from fever. Luke hurried to boil some water, crushing a few herbs he kept for emergencies. He had learned to take care of wounds back during the war. He dipped the cloth into the warm mixture and pressed it against her forehead. Her breathing eased a little. He stayed awake all night, listening to the crackle of the fire and watching her sleep. When the first light of morning touched the window, she opened her eyes again. This time she didn't look afraid. She turned her head slowly toward him, her lips dry and trembling. For a moment, they just stared at each other. She tried to speak, her voice weak and broken. "Why?" she asked softly. Luke frowned a little. "Why what?" he asked. "Why, help me," she whispered. He looked down at the floor for a moment, then said quietly, "Because you were still breathing, and I couldn't leave someone alive to die alone." Her eyes filled with tears. She turned her face away, trying to hide them, but Luke saw the glimmer. He didn't ask any more questions. He knew pain when he saw it. Over the next few hours, he gave her small sips of soup and kept the fire going. She tried to sit up but fell back too weak. He told her to rest. When she finally fell asleep again, Luke went outside to chop some wood. Every time he struck the axe, he thought of her, of what could drive people to abandon one of their own. By afternoon, she was awake again. She looked around the cabin, studying the walls, the stove, the shelf with a few books. Her gaze stopped on him. She spoke slowly, trying to find the right English words. "You, not from tribe," she said quietly. Luke nodded. "No, just a cowboy. Live alone out here." She blinked slowly, trying to understand. "Cowboy saved me?" He smiled faintly. "Guess so." She lowered her eyes and whispered, "They left me. Said I bring bad spirits." Her voice trembled. "But I only tried to help a sick child. They said I made him worse." Luke listened quietly. He didn't know what to say. He had seen how hard life could be in these lands. Sometimes fear made people do cruel things. "You're safe now," he finally said. "No one's gonna hurt you here." The woman's eyes softened. She didn't fully trust him yet, but something in his voice felt honest. She nodded slowly and whispered her name, Naya. Luke repeated it under his breath. Naya. It sounded soft like the wind through trees. For the rest of the day she rested while he worked outside, keeping an ear open for her voice. That evening, as the sun went down again, she sat up for the first time. Her eyes followed him as he poured more soup into a bowl. He handed it to her carefully. "Eat," he said. "You need strength." She took it with shaking hands, sipping slowly. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the fire crackling in the stove. When she was done, she looked at him and said softly, "You saved me. I won't forget." Luke nodded but didn't answer. He wasn't used to thanks. He only looked out the window where the stars were beginning to rise again over the quiet desert. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel so empty. Outside, the night wind moved through the grass, carrying the same whisper that had followed her across the desert. But now it sounded softer, almost peaceful. And for Luke, that lonely cowboy who had lived with silence for too long, something had changed forever. The next morning, the sound of birds woke Luke. The sky outside the small window was bright and soft, and the smell of rain was in the air. He turned to check on Naya. She was still weak but no longer pale. She sat quietly on the edge of the bed, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair fell loosely down her back, and her eyes followed every sound like someone who had lived too long in fear. Luke spoke gently. "You're feeling better." She nodded slowly. "Better and little," she said in her soft, careful English. Her voice was rough but steadier than before. He poured her a cup of warm tea and handed it to her. She took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." Luke smiled and sat across from her. He wasn't a man of many words, but there was something peaceful about having someone else to talk to. "You can stay here till you're strong again," he said. "After that, we'll figure out what's next." Naya looked down at the steaming cup, thinking about his words. Her tribe had left her to die. Even if she went back, there would be no welcome. She had no home, no family, no place where she was safe. She looked up at Luke again and said softly, "I have nowhere." He didn't reply right away. He could see the pain in her eyes, the same emptiness he had felt after losing his own family years ago. He finally said, "Then this place will do for now." Days passed and Naya began to regain her strength. She helped around the cabin, sweeping the floor, cleaning dishes, and feeding the animals. Luke tried to stop her, saying she needed to rest, but she insisted. "Work makes heart alive," she told him one morning, smiling for the first time since he'd found her. Her smile surprised him. It was gentle but full of life, and it made the cabin feel different, warmer somehow. He started to look forward to hearing her quiet footsteps, her soft hum while she worked, and the way she carefully spoke new English words each day, repeating them until she got them right. But even with the peace growing between them, Luke felt a small worry deep inside. One evening, while fixing the fence near his pasture, he noticed tracks. Several horses had passed nearby. The prints were fresh. He followed them for a short while and found broken branches and ashes from an old campfire. Someone had been watching the valley. That night he sat outside the cabin with his rifle across his knees. The stars were bright, and the wind carried faint sounds from the hills. Naya came out quietly, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. You think they come? She asked. Luke didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie. Maybe. If they find out you're alive, they might come looking. She stood beside him silently for a long moment. Then she said, "If they come, I will go. I don't want them to hurt you." He shook his head. "You're not going anywhere. I didn't save you just to watch you get taken again." His voice was firm but calm. Naya looked at him with deep eyes. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. Luke stared at the horizon. "Because once someone cared for me when I didn't deserve it. I owe that kindness to someone else now." The next morning, clouds gathered over the mountains. The air was heavy, and the horses were uneasy. Naya helped Luke gather the tools and feed the animals, but both of them could feel that something wasn't right. By afternoon, they saw dust rising far in the distance. Riders were coming. Luke tightened his jaw and walked to the barn, checking his horse and gear. Naya stood near the door, her face pale. "It's them," she said quietly. "Stay inside," Luke told her. When the riders arrived, there were 5 of them, men from her tribe wearing feathers and carrying bows. They stopped a few feet from the cabin, their eyes sharp and cold. The one in front dismounted and spoke roughly. "You have our woman," he said in broken English. Luke stood straight, his hat low. "She's not your woman. You left her to die." The man's eyes darkened. "She broke our law. You cannot keep her." Naya stepped out before Luke could stop her. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "You left me because I tried to save a child," she said in her own language. "I did nothing wrong." The men looked at her but didn't move. One of them spat on the ground. "You belong to the earth now," he said coldly. Luke moved closer to Naya, standing between her and the men. "She's under my roof now," he said firmly, "and no one's taking her from here." There was silence. The leader stared at Luke, measuring his strength. The other riders shifted on their horses, waiting for his word. The wind blew hard and dust spun around them. Finally, the leader said, "You fight for her, then her life is yours. But remember, she is cursed." He turned his horse and rode off, followed by the others. When they were gone, Naya sank to her knees, shaking with relief. Luke helped her up and led her inside. She was crying softly, though her tears were mixed with something like peace. "They won't come back," Luke said. "They said what they needed to say." Naya wiped her face. "They think I'm cursed. Maybe they're right." He looked at her for a long moment and said quietly, "No, you're blessed. You got another chance to live." That night, the rain finally fell. It hit the roof in steady rhythm, washing the dust from the air. Naya sat by the window watching it. "When I was little," she said softly, "my mother told me rain means forgiveness. Maybe sky forgives us when people don't." Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe so." The next days were calm again. The tribe didn't return and life began to settle. Naya planted a small garden near the cabin, using seeds she found in Luke's storage. She said she wanted to grow herbs and corn. Luke built a small fence around it to keep the animals out. Working side by side, they laughed more often. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Naya said, "When you found me, I wanted to die. I had no hope left, but you gave me back my breath." Luke looked at her quietly. "You gave yourself back your breath. I just happened to be there," she smiled. "Still, I thank you." Time moved on and the valley turned green with spring. Naya's garden began to bloom and she sang while she worked. The sound of her voice carried across the fields, mixing with the sound of birds and the wind. One morning, Luke found a small piece of wood by his bed. On it, Naya had carved a symbol from her tribe, a sign that meant protection and gratitude. When he asked her about it, she said softly, "It means you are not alone anymore." Luke didn't know what to say. He looked out over the land at the rising sun touching the hills, and for the first time in many years he felt something deep inside his heart. Peace. From that day on, they lived quietly together. People from town sometimes saw the cowboy and the woman tending their ranch and wondered about their story. But they didn't need to explain it to anyone. They both knew what it meant. 2 broken souls who found each other in the middle of nowhere and chose to keep living when life had already given up on them. The desert wind still passed through the valley, but now it carried the sound of laughter instead of loneliness. And when it rained again, Luke looked at Naya and said softly, "Guess the sky forgave us one more time." She smiled back, her eyes shining with quiet strength. And in that small cabin, once built for a man who wanted to be alone. There was warmth again, the kind that comes not from fire but from kindness that refuses to die.